Good afternoon to those on the East Coast and Central time zones. Good morning to Mountain Time and California and the West Coast. Glad you could join us today for a special webinar. We're proud to be partnering with the Wireless Research Center of North Carolina, where they've been having a lot of weather there, if you've been noticing on the news. My name is Mark Maynard. I'm from Watching Labs Academy, and I'm your host today. And we'll be providing a lot of good information on IoT. It's one of our recurring topics on the Watching Labs Academy webinar series. Just some housekeeping stuff first before we begin. If you're on your WebEx, all attendees' microphones are muted, and recording this event is underway. You'll receive a link to that in the day or two following the event. A training certificate will also be sent out, and a full screen view is available from the view commands on WebEx. Also, I'd like to encourage you to ask questions. You can do that by using the Q&A function on WebEx. Type down your questions, and at the end, I'll read them out, and our presenter today will be answering them at the end. We do that because sometimes we have several hundred attendees, and it becomes quite burdensome to try to address those by voice. If we don't get to your questions today, we'll make sure that we follow up with you. Now I'd like to introduce you to the presenter today, Shruti Sora. She's a senior staff engineer at the Wireless Research Center of North Carolina. And this is the WRC is a nonprofit which is focused on the economic development in the wireless sector. She has over a decade of experience in RF antenna engineering in the commercial, defense, and medical device markets, and has developed products from early concept to production. Prior to coming to WRC, she held technical positions at RF Micro Devices, HTC Corporation, Sony Ericsson, and Harris Corporation. So now I'd like to hand over the presentation to Shruti Sora. Shruti, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Thanks for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Shruti Sora, and I'm with the Wireless Research Center of North Carolina. And today I'm going to talk to you about bringing IoT devices to the network, specifically from the RF, which is radio frequency, and antenna point of view, so looking at it from that perspective. For those of you that have not heard of the Wireless Research Center, we were founded in 2010, and we are an independent, self-funded 501c3 organization. We've helped over 250 organizations with R&D, research with wireless products, and we cover all sorts of different market sectors, from commercial to medical, aviation, public safety, and DoD. We've received multiple grants and initiatives, and we are a leader in standardization, development, and harmonizing all sorts of wireless technologies, from wearable, medical, 5G, aviation, sensor, IoT systems. Specifically today, I'm going to talk about the IoT aspects, but if you have any questions about the other sectors, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is at the end of the presentation. So here's just some pictures of some of the test chambers at the Wireless Research Center. The first picture is our Stargate 64 anechoic chamber, and we are certified and can provide certified OTA tests as well as development and engineering testing. I'm on the engineering services side, so we provide companies with help with RF and antenna, all the way from design to debugging to brainstorming, whatever it might be. And then field testing. We actually have 3 cell-on-wheel towers that we utilize for design and deployment of new networks as well as new types of infrastructures. So this is just a screenshot from our website that has a list of our additional services, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. And lastly, Riot is also a part of the Wireless Center's Economic Development Initiative, and basically Riot is a consortium of different companies and members that are involved in the IoT space. And if you're interested in joining, please contact me as well. We have over 6,000 individual members and 80 companies, all the way from large multinational corporations to one-person startups. And the whole thing is to create a collaborative environment where IoT is not done alone. IoT requires partnership of different sectors, from hardware to software to security to certification and all aspects, and trying to make everybody work together to move their projects along. We have different events and training opportunities, so feel free to reach out. And lastly, Washington Labs. Washington Labs and Wireless Center complement each other quite well, with Washington Labs EMC and wireless environmental product safety and providing all those types of test facilities, along with the Wireless Center's antenna and radio testing and development. So together, it covers your product from start to finish. So the goal of this presentation is to help you develop a successful RF, and I'll use RF, which is radio frequency, an antenna solution all the way from start to finish. So when it's an idea all the way to mass production. And the goal here is to pass certification on the first try. So certification tests take time and they take money. And if you fail, then you have to do it again. And so the goal here is to help you pass it in one shot. And I'll talk about different things to ask yourself at different stages of the product cycle to help enable that. So the IoT, Internet of Things ecosystem, they're used everywhere, and the number of connected devices is growing by the minute. I've heard people say that it is the fourth industrial revolution, and all of that data that's being collected from sensors and such all throughout different ecosystems, how does that data get connected from one to another? Well, it requires an RF, a radio, and an antenna to communicate to each other. And there are lots of choices and different standards that you can select, from LTE and Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Zigbee, LoRa, Z-Wave, satellite, RFID, Sigfox, and then 5G, which is up and coming. And how do you pick which one's the best for your application, and how do you select what radio to use and what antenna to use, and what are the specifications for those pieces of hardware? And I'll talk through some questions that are key to help answering, which standard to select. So when you have a radio and an antenna in an IoT device, it does require additional testing. And there are three main categories of testing. You've got regulatory requirements, which is the government requirements to be able to sell your device in that country, like FCC requirements. You've got carrier specifications. If you're going to put your device on a certain carrier, like a Verizon or an AT&T, they're going to have specific requirements that you must meet to be able to be on their network. And lastly is use case testing. Sometimes use case testing is sometimes skipped because you meet the regulatory and you meet the carrier, and then you think you're done. But the use case is actually, how does the end customer use it in that specific application? Is it a large device that's sitting in the corner of a room, or is it a small wearable device? And it's important to be able to make sure that you test it for all of the requirements and specifications, but also how the end customer is going to utilize it. And so those three main categories of testing are important to consider throughout the entire product cycle. So I'll go through some different items to consider when you're going through a wireless IoT device product development. One option is what we call the fast plug-and-play approach. And so there are many certified RF modules that are pre-certified for certain aspects of the regulatory testing, and you can plug that into an off-the-shelf antenna that you can get, just off of different distributor websites. But does that mean when you just plug those two pieces in together, are you ready for certification? And the answer is not yet. It's extremely risky, and it may work, but it's risky in meeting the regulatory and carrier requirements. It may not fit as far as the use case requirements, and you may have a lower probability of maintaining a connection. So when your end user and end customer has trouble maintaining a connection, or you have trouble with getting that sensor data from one point to the other, then the IoT system is in risk. So it's important and critical to have the radio and antenna portion working properly, and going beyond the fast plug-and-play approach. And a few extra checks and a few extra questions and answering those can save you a lot of money and time. So some key points in the hardware product design cycle to ask yourself are, basically there are 4 different main stages. One, you've got the ideation stage, which is when it's just a brainstorm idea. How do you get this idea into a product? You've got the engineering side, and then you've got the design side, and both of those need to work together. You can't have a piece of hardware that doesn't look pretty. It needs to be functional and pretty. And then there's the validation. And early system verification can save time and money overall. If you start early at the ideation and design and engineering stage versus starting your verification at the validation stage, it may cost a lot more to be able to fix and redesign your device. So it's important to start early at proof of concept prototypes and when it's just an idea. So I'll go through some questions to ask yourself at early concept, which is the early ideation stage, that just helps you figure out what way should you design your antennas, what specs, and what radio standards are best. So the goal here is to define the RF and antenna requirements at ideation, and then you figure out what those are, and then you also determine if the requirements are realistic. Just coming up with the requirements and not being able to see if it's feasible to implement throughout the entire product cycle is going to be really important. So you need to do and build proof of concept prototypes to be able to test and verify your system, even if it's just hand-built, 3D printed, whatever, to make sure that those requirements are realistic and feasible moving forward. So here's a list of questions to ask yourself at early concept to be able to help define what those requirements should be. What is the use case environment? So a simple question, how will the device be used? Is it something that's wearable or mobile? Is it always moving around? Or is it something that's stationary in fixed location? Is it always going to be in that corner and not touched at all? Is it a big device? Is it a small device? One other thing that comes up with like first responder type of applications is it mission critical? Does it require that, it's something that is a matter of, life or death, where it needs to 100% be able to make that connection. So understanding how the device will be used will help you figure out what antenna criteria and requirements and what style of antenna to use. So once you know that, the next question to ask is, what does it talk to? Is it talking to something on the other side of a residential application? Is it talking to a satellite? Is it talking to a base station tower or a small cell network? What might be utilized in a connected home application may be very different from what might be used on an automobile or an outdoor, environment that needs to talk to a satellite. And understanding just the base requirements and goals will help define what the antenna and RF specifications are. That'll help you decide what frequency to operate at, what the antenna pattern shape will be, and I'll talk more about the different antenna, what pattern shape means. And then the propagation loss. You know, if you're trying to connect, if you're on like floor 20 of a building and trying to connect to something on the first floor, there's, 20 floors of propagation loss, versus if you're in a dense urban environment versus a rural environment. Understanding how your device will be used in the different applications will help you define what those will be. Once you know that, then you can figure out how do you test it in a more controlled environment. You know, what measurement metrics are really important, and how do you really implement that use case scenario in a test chamber or in a controlled field environment to be able to verify the performance prior to launching your product. So selecting a radio standard, there's so many different options out there, and there are a lot of good options. But, being able to select what is the best for your application, it goes to, asking yourself, how is data transferred, how often, and how far? If you're looking for a high throughput or a low data rate, if you're going to have something that's streaming 4K video versus it might only need to talk to the network, once a day with very minimal information, you're going to pick two different radio standards for that. Is it a mesh or a point-to-point network? How far does it have to talk to? Is it just talking to its next sensor, 5 feet away? Or is it having to talk across, town to a certain base station? What's the location and range? Again, is it an indoor environment, outdoor environment? What are you trying? What's the goal of that product? The battery life, the selection of the radio standard and the high throughput or the low data rate comparison will also impact your battery life requirement. And then the geographic regions. There are different regions that have different unlicensed frequencies. There are different regions that have different regulatory requirements. So are you trying to make one device that works for the whole world, or are you going to have different devices that work for different parts of the country or different countries? So once you ask yourself that, you can figure out what the radio standard selection will be. And you might not just have one antenna or one radio. You may have multiple antennas and multiple radios. The geographic region will help you decide what frequency bands within those radios that you'll utilize as well, based on the location, the network, and the geographic region. And so sometimes you might find that you might need Bluetooth plus, cellular and Wi-Fi or GPS or maybe one covers it all. But asking yourself, the goal of the product and what is your goal of data transfer will help you figure out the best radio solution for your product. So the other aspect is mechanical design. And the structure actually impacts the antenna quite a bit. One thing to always keep in mind is that the entire mechanical structure is the antenna. It's not just the one piece of metal that you're putting in the corner of your product. It's impacted by everything surrounding it, and it's impacted by the entire PCB, the metal around it. So questions to ask yourself are, what's the device size and what materials are near the antenna? Where will the antennas be located, and how are they connected to the PCB? Is it a spring contact? Is it soldered? Is it a coax cable? And where are all the metal pieces in the device, and how are they connected? You'll find when you're debugging antennas later on in the project, understanding where all those metal pieces are and how they're connected can help save you a lot of time later on in the debugging aspect, in the validation portion of the project. And always remember that the entire structure is the antenna. So changes, depending on the wavelength, changes on one side of the device could impact the antenna even if it's physically far away. Things to note are even, small aspects such as like cosmetic paint color, the metal content in paint, even little things like that can impact the antenna performance. So it's always good to think about the industrial design, the mechanical structure, all of those at the early stages of the project. Next is the module selection. So what is your total production volume? If you've just got a few, a small production volume, then potentially a certified radio module may be, your best option. A lot of those tests are finished for you. A lot of the design and engineering efforts also finished for you, and it's a drop-in, and you only have a small set of regulatory tests to complete afterwards. If you've got a large number of total production volume, like something in like a handset phone type of millions and millions, then a custom module may be the right answer for your application. But thinking about how many devices you want to sell and going with a certified or custom radio module will impact the number of certified tests that you'll have to do later. And then thinking about the certification plan, it's important to think about this early in the concept at the ideation stage and not right at the end of, oh gosh, I've got this device to launch and now I need to figure out what test to run. It's important to think about that early on. What's your launch plan and how many certification tests do you need? Thinking about the number of network carriers that you want to deploy with and how many geographic regions you want to sell your device for. And that'll impact how many regulatory requirements you may have, because each country will have their own different requirements, and what carrier requirements you may need to meet, because even within one country, different carriers will have different requirements. And between carrier and regulatory tests, there are different requirements if you're on a licensed or unlicensed band, and you might have different number of tests between certified modules versus a custom design. The custom design will have more tests. The certified module will complete some of the conducted tests, but you'll still have some radiated tests afterwards. The important aspect here is to make sure you plan for design reviews and pre-check tests early in the schedule and in the budget for every stage of your prototype, all the way to final production, and making sure that you have design reviews early on in the concept to make sure that you're getting all the design hooks in place. So maybe you just change a surface mount component and your issue is fixed versus having to respin a board. As many design hooks early on as possible is always, the least risky. And lastly, thinking about software features. And some people might say, well, this is the antenna and the radio. Why do I need to think about software? Well, there are a lot of smart features that could be added, as well as debugging tools that could help you during the development of your product. As far as smart features, there might be aspects that would help your radio performance if certain hardware is turned and toggled on and off. Or if you utilize sensors to decide what environment it is and be able to tune your antenna specifically for those applications. There are also, how do you modify the radio parameters? So when you're trying to debug regulatory issues or even noise type of issues, you might need to be able to toggle the frequency, power level, and modulation. And just knowing how you set those parameters and just turn them on and off, and having those requests early on in your software development cycle, so when you do need them later in the product cycle, it's all available and ready. So it's important to think about all aspects of the product, even if it is just for the RF and the antenna portion of the product. So with just answering those questions, you'll find that you can plan for the RF and antenna design early in the project, and then hopefully you'll have less surprises later. And one aspect at ideation is actually estimating what will the antenna size be. And this is during, after ideation and during the design and engineering stage. And so this is a rough guideline, and it really depends on the application. But as a high-level guideline, you can assume that the approximate device size is about 150 over the frequency in gigahertz. And that'll give you an approximate device size in millimeters. And I could go into all the technical details, but I'll keep it at a high level at this point. But basically, you need to be a certain ratio of the device size is related to the frequency and the wavelength. And so if your device size is really small and you're trying to target a really low frequency, you may not have the same performance that you desire. To put it in perspective, low frequency cellular, you're going to have a device size around 214 millimeters. As you start getting to like 2.4 gigahertz with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and you're getting to much smaller at 63 millimeters. And once you get to higher frequency Wi-Fi at 6 gigahertz, you're at 25 millimeters. So you can see that your device size has a wide range, and it really depends on what radio standards and you select to put into your product. So what happens if the device size is smaller? You might be able to try to say, I'm going to do a low-frequency cellular device, but it's only going to be, 50 millimeters. You can do that, but you may have reduced antenna efficiency and reduced frequency bandwidth. So what does that mean? That basically means that you may have a risk of maintaining a connection or a risk to meeting the specifications. So it's really important at the early engineering and ideation stage to be able to build something and see if you're, what the risk is and how good your performance is if you are, especially going with a smaller device size. But it's always better to go with, the optimal size so then you can get the antenna performance you want. The main goal here is to be able to send data across the IoT network. So if the antenna cannot connect to the network, then you may have an issue of meeting the specs. So the next part is on the design and engineering side as well, of how do you read an antenna data sheet. And so for a non-antenna or radio engineer, sometimes antenna data sheets are not as straightforward as other components. So I'll go through some definitions and key terminology that will help you through that process. So they're not so easy to compare two different data sheets, and what I'll call antenna A and antenna B. But it's important to understand the data sheet scenario and the environment, and how does that apply to your application. And then making sure that, understanding the effects if your application doesn't match what the data sheet says, what are the impacts and what performance will change and how do you optimize that. So the first thing you want to check is make sure the frequency of operation matches your device specifications. These two antennas are cellular antennas. Now you wouldn't use these for like a GPS application. So you want to make sure that the frequency that you desire matches the antenna that you're looking at. The next thing is understanding the test scenario for each data sheet and understanding if each of the plots are referencing that same scenario. Some things that can be different are what's the ground plane size, the cable orientation, the layout, the location of the antenna. And so all of those things can impact performance. So it's important to understand what the test scenario is and then how does that compare to your production IoT device. So the next thing is what is peak gain? You see that on a lot of data sheets. And it doesn't mean that higher is always better. It really depends on your application. But in general, an omnidirectional pattern is a lower peak gain. And you can see on the right figure where the donut-shaped pattern, that's more omnidirectional. So that means that the antenna pattern or is able to basically connect at any point in an omnidirectional fashion. A directional fashion basically means you've almost got like a pencil beam that is pointing in one way, and if you're pointed, if it's pointed north and you're looking east, you may not connect. And a directional pattern tends to have a higher peak gain. This is a great metric for stationary devices. So if you've got something that's always going to stay in the same place and it's always going to connect to the same thing, a directional pattern with higher peak gain may be a good option for you. But it's always important to note that performance will change based on the size and location. And as your device gets larger and you get to higher frequencies, higher peak gain is a lot easier to achieve. If you're trying to go at a low frequency with a really small device, it's going to be really hard to achieve that directional pattern. So another metric is efficiency. So what does that mean? That basically means that it's the average intensity of the whole 3D pattern. And it can be presented in both percentage and decibels. And the cheat sheet here is that 0 dB equals 100%. So that's best case. So that means that everything you put in, all of it comes out. Minus 3 dB is 50%, and minus 6 dB is 25%. Efficiency is a great metric for mobile devices. That means that your device might be wearable or it's moving all the time and its orientation is changing. So that means that you want to look at, the entire sphere and how does that, what's the probability of connecting to the network with this metric. Always keep in mind that efficiency will change based on size and location. So like in the plot to the picture to the right, depending on the size of your PCB, you may have different results. Lastly, another metric that's important is called mismatch loss. So basically, how close is the input to a reference impedance? Typically, it's 50 ohms. You may see this in two different terms, return loss and VSWR, VSWR. And both of them are basically presenting the same thing, but in different ways. In return loss, you want to look for numbers that are more negative. That means that it's closer to the reference impedance. For VSWR, you want to target closer to 1-to-1. 1-to-1 basically means 50 ohms or whatever the reference impedance might be. And a higher value has a higher mismatch. As a quick reference, half a dB of mismatch loss equals a 2-to-1 VSWR or a minus 10 dB return loss. So when you're comparing different data sheets and they may use different terminology, it's just good to make sure that you put them all on the same page using, when you're trying to compare. But when it comes to your specific application, I'd say pretty much 99% of the time, the datasheet case will not match the device scenario. So what do you do then? It's important to utilize proof of concept prototypes to make sure that you can measure the use case performance. A proof of concept prototype could be using copper tape, it can be using 3D printed parts, or just, handcrafting something. Be able to sense, the device size and put that antenna on there and measure it and see if those requirements and if the specifications that you're trying to meet are feasible. Simulations are also a great way to evaluate the design at early concept and come up with an antenna solution. But it's important to look at the antenna pattern and the impedance together. So that means chamber measurements as well as benchtop measurements. The chamber measurements, here's some pictures of our anechoic chamber, and we actually have full body phantom, so you can do wearable type of testing, as well as small antenna testing. Or we cover a large range of sizes in our chamber, but just taking a hand-built prototype and throwing it in the antenna chamber to see what that peak gain or the peak efficiency or the average efficiency is will be able to help tell you a lot at that early ideation stage. And prior to you having hand-built parts, you can also utilize simulations, and it allows you to visualize things that you may not be able to see with your normal eyes. The last picture on the right shows you how a certain module by itself has a very directional antenna pattern, but the second you put it into this printer device, the pattern changes completely. So once you start implementing and integrating these antennas into your full mechanical system, it will change. And so it's important to start optimizing that from the early stages. And this is something that we do quite often at the Wireless Center and are happy to help out if you do need help with this. So then once you get through your prototype, early concept ideation stages, and then a couple versions of their prototypes, then you start getting into the validation stage. So how do you prepare for certification? So the key is, like I've been saying, it's important to do pre-certification tests and optimization early in the prototype stage. Build proof of concept prototypes, build work-like prototypes with the mechanics, the radio, the PCB, start adding those software features, and start checking as much as you can early on. And the hope is, then once you get to the final production validation, where the tests are a lot more expensive, you have a better chance of passing certification in a single run. So you can save time and money overall, and not delay your product schedule if you pass your certification in one run. And passing means one is your carrier specifications, so the regulatory over-the-air type tests, as well, the carrier OTA transmit and receive type tests, as well as the regulatory side, like the FCC, whatever each geographic region has for their country. So one thing is a lot of folks for IoT devices use what is called a pre-certified module. And so that's a great option. That means that some of the tests are completed and passing, and it reduces a lot of your design effort. The conducted performance is verified. All of the layout is done for that module. You just put it down and then look at the surrounding devices that are needed. But that doesn't mean you're done. What is still needed is you need a full system device testing. You need over-the-air OTA radiated testing. That means how well does your device transmit, how well does your device receive in the full system. Sometimes you can have issues with the receiver where there's noise coming from a power supply or a clock signal or whatever it might be in that full system. And you might be able to transmit real well, but you may not be able to listen and receive very well at all, and that usually requires a hardware fix, which might mean a new prototype board spin. It may mean component changes or even tuning the antenna and using a different design. So it's important to be able to pre-check and start early. The next thing is also making sure that you complete all of the regulatory tests. So although the certified module completes a lot of the conducted aspects, you'll still have radiated testing, spurious emissions, idle mode of the full system test device, that making sure that you meet what the FCC is looking for in your full system beyond the module itself. So the key here is start early, because you don't want to have surprises late in the verification stage, because that could delay your whole schedule. So some aspects of the OTA and FCC pre-checks. OTA is over the air, and both of these will require a functional device. So the proof of concept prototypes and the early prototype testing with utilizing the chamber and measuring the antenna efficiency and such, those don't have to be functional. Those can just be hand-built and clearly just looking at the mechanics and the structure of the device and where does the antenna go and how is it optimized. Once you start getting into over-the-air and FCC regulatory types of testing, or whatever country it may be, you're going to need the functional device. That means the software, the hardware, and the full system integrated. OTA over-the-air basically checks the radiated performance in the pattern. And again, here's some pictures of the body phantoms in a chamber that we have at the wireless center. And essentially, one, you want to check to what the carrier specifies, or the network requirements, as well as you want to make sure that you're testing the use case scenarios. So if it's something that's worn on the body, utilize a body phantom, and you can see 3 here. That's a full body phantom, a wrist phantom, as well as a head and hand phantom. So utilize phantoms such as that to be able to mimic the performance of the device on the body. So once a customer purchases it, it's optimized for the actual use case application. Whether it's a wireless refrigerator or a smart meter or a trash can, whatever it might be, making sure that you test things like that in a chamber, and making sure that in its use case that the pattern shape. So here at the bottom, you can see an example of an antenna pattern, and this particular antenna pattern, it's pointing towards the upper hemisphere direction, and so making sure that it's what you expect. The next part is FCC testing, or regulatory testing in general, if it's any country, and that checks the radiated and the conducted regulatory compliance. So the number of tests here really depends on if you're using a pre-certified or a custom module. If you're using a custom module, there'll be some additional tests that you'll have to run. And here's a picture of Washington Labs, their chamber that they can run EMC testing on. And you'll see plots like this at the bottom where you'll see measurements over frequency, and you'll have to be below a certain line to be able to pass and sell in that country. There are also conducted tests in making sure of what does your waveform look like, what is the modulation, making sure that basically your device plays well with everything around it, and it's not going to, hurt your neighbor's Wi-Fi or, interfere with the FM station down the street. Basically, all the regulatory test is wanting to make sure that you play well with others. OTA testing is making sure of how well do you transmit or receive. So the goal is once you get to final certification, you measure it, you pass, and you only have to measure it, you only have to go through it once. You meet all your requirements and you're ready to ship. That means you meet all the carrier requirements, you meet all the regulatory requirements, and you've also verified at the use case scenarios that it'll actually, not only for the carrier and regulatory side, but even the use case scenario, it's going to meet, and your customer will have a great experience and it's ready to ship. And with that, then once it's shipped, you're connected to the whole IoT ecosystem, and you've got a whole bunch of connected wireless devices, transmitting all sorts of sensor data, cool video, whatever it might be. But just having some key questions and thinking about some different just key requirements and making sure that you're testing and pre-checking early in the concept and early in your production cycle will help save you a lot of time later on. So that's all I had. Feel free to, contact me if you have any questions. I've put my email address as well as the Wireless Center as well as Riot's websites up on the screen here. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And Mark, I'll open the floor for any questions.
Okay, I just have one so far. You had mentioned that you can have a certified module, but not when you put it into the overall product chassis, the aspects of the patterns and levels can change. What are the more common issues you see with this?
Yeah, so a lot of times when you take an off-the-shelf component, whether it be a certified module or an off-the-shelf antenna, one is just making sure that for the module side, some issues are, what's surrounding it. So the entire board layout, you can have noise as well as RFC, radiated spurious emissions, and harmonic type of issues, which will impact you from the regulatory side. And then the noise on the sensitivity side will impact you on the OTA carrier type of requirements of how well does your device is able to receive information. So it's important to get those tests done early to make sure that there aren't other aspects of your system like power supplies or other networks on or even other radios on your device that could be causing interference. And then from the antenna perspective, when you take an off-the-shelf antenna and integrate it into your device, a lot of times it's making sure that it's it's staying within what the antenna manufacturer intended. Whether it's keeping to their design rules, certain locations of antenna placement can be better than others. In looking at the surrounding environment. And so those early proof of concept prototype tests and the early simulations and chamber tests can help alleviate some of those issues later on.
Okay, thanks. And these two URLs you're providing for the Wireless Center of North Carolina and the NC Riot, the Initiative to Create a Collaborative IoT Ecosystem, what kind of information can you find at those sites?
Sure. So at the Wireless Center, you can get some information about our different services and the different equipment that we have. And then it'll also have a form if you want to contact us about any about reaching us as far as engineering services or test services. We're happy to, we are a nonprofit and we are IP neutral, so we're happy to work with any company, as a one-person startup to a multinational corporation. As far as NC Riot, that will give you information of the different companies that are involved in that collaborative system, as well as upcoming events and even information about our upcoming incubator series. So we have a 12-week series for startups that basically it's a workshop and companies can apply to be part of that. And we help them with, all the way from, taking your idea from, from a concept all the way to how do you write business plans, how do you get startup funding, marketing plans, and all the aspects of starting a new IoT company. As well as events, we have nationwide covering all sorts of different aspects of IoT, from security to smart cities or smart health, whatever it might be. So you can find information about, and both of them, NC Riot is part of the Wireless Research Center, so it's all the same organization, but you can find more info on both of those websites.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate the information on IoT. We hope that you and your neighbors in North Carolina are faring okay and will stay safe. So if you have more questions on international approvals or other topics, you can always contact me at Washington Laboratories. And if you have something specific to today's presentation, you can contact Shruti Sora at the information given on the previous slide. I want to let you know about the upcoming Symposium Product Compliance Engineering from the IEEE. This is put on by the Product Safety Engineering Society, but it covers all aspects of compliance. If you're on the East Coast, this might be convenient for you in Boston. It's a 2-day symposium and covers EMC, product safety, environmental, industrial, military, all aspects of it. You can see more information at the website, the URL I've given. And also want to remind you about the upcoming international approval webinars from Washington Labs Academy. Next month we have one on Taiwan, November on South Korea, and December on non-EU European compliance. This is European countries are not members of the European Union. Leading among those is Russia with its EEU, a consortium of 5 countries. So you won't want to mess that if that's one of your market areas. You can also go to the URL given there to see more information on it. Well, thank y'all for joining us today, another part of our free webinar series. Feel free to contact me with any suggestions for upcoming webinars or any other information you're looking for in international compliance. We'd be glad to help you with your next project. Thank you for joining us today. You'll be receiving a PDF copy of the presentation as well as a link to the recording. Let your colleagues know about these, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.